There are places you never want to see smoke. Under the hood of your car, an airplane cabin, basically anywhere that isn't a pig roast, a camp bonfire, or a papal conclave. But one place you really never want to see smoke is inside of a tunnel. Because the entire point of transportation infrastructure, like tunnels, is that you're immune from the forces of weather, unwelcoming terrain, and even time doesn't really matter because they're designed to be continuously open and accessible, well lit and traversable, and, barring the actions of other drivers, generally safe. But an otherwise normal day in 1999 bore witness to one of the worst transportation catastrophes in modern history up to that point. A fire broke out inside the Mont Blanc Tunnel that linked the nations of France and Italy. It was an unspeakable catastrophe that claimed over 36 lives and saw drivers, public officials, and even one of the world's most famous automotive companies brought to trial to answer for the horror that occurred on that tragic Wednesday morning. How did the Mont Blanc Tunnel catch fire? Were the people brought to trial truly responsible for the tragedy? And could this have been prevented? This is RCR Stories, the Mont Blanc Tunnel Fire. Wednesday, March 24th, 1999. An Italian motorcyclist named Pierlucio Tinassi approaches the Mont Blanc Tunnel on his BMW K75 motorbike. Opening in 1965, the tunnel was located in Chamonix-Haute-Savoie, France, on the French end, and Courmayeur et Ostavali, Italy, on the Italian end. From day one, the tunnel was huge for the region, significantly reducing the travel time between the French Alps and the Italian metropolitan cities of Turin and Milan. Yet despite being Italian himself, Pierlucio Tinassi was not entering from the Italian side of the tunnel, but the French side. Nicknamed Spadino, after a kind of small sword, it was kind of fitting that Pierlucio was on a vehicle as agile and precise as a motorcycle, even if the reason for the nickname was his very lean frame. But then that kind of played into his agility on the motorcycle, because he was an avid motorcyclist, and trips like these were not uncommon. I mean, anyone fortunate enough to be reasonably local to this area could be forgiven for wanting to take these sorts of trips whenever they could. Even if it was just to commute, I imagine it would be exhilarating to ride your motorcycle through this terrain. Afternoon wasn't far off as Spadino advanced along the highway towards the staggered alpine horizon. Pines and fir thickened the skyline, splashing color against the Alps and the monotone majesty of its glacial peaks and brutalist stonework. It was beautiful terrain, although the empty eye socket of the tunnel ahead didn't exactly inspire distracted awe. If the tunnel could be assigned any quality of beauty at all, it was in its function, how it linked nations, connected people, and facilitated the symbiosis of trade. We don't generally think of arteries as beautiful, but the human heart wouldn't be much more than a fleshy paperweight without them. Not too far ahead of Spadino is a VOLVO FH12 tractor-trailer, which has just reached the toll booth to Mont Blanc Tunnel. Gilbert de Grave had been a truck driver for over 25 years, and on this morning he was entrusted with transporting some 8 tons of margarine and 12 tons of flour, which sounds like a lot, because it is, but it also wasn't exactly an uncommon amount of material to transport, since, depending on the configuration of the FH12, load capacity could top out at over 20 tons, or as high as more than twice that number. It was about 10:46 a.m. Central European time when the VOLVO truck came through the toll booth and entered the tunnel. De Grave and his Volvo would not be alone among working men passing through. French truck driver Maurice Lebras and Italian truck driver Patrick Devoisseux were transporting their own cargo across the vast, shadowed expanse of the Mont Blanc Tunnel, as the passageway was typically populated with heavy trucks transporting goods between regions. Interestingly, Patrick Devoisseux was not only a motorcyclist himself when he wasn't hauling stuff in his Renault Express van, but he was actually a friend and former co-worker of Spadino's. Small world, huh? Of course, the Mont Blanc Tunnel was a civilian route as well, with commuting men and women and even families passing through the single-bore tunnel, which stretched some 11.6 kilometers or 7.21 miles, and stood approximately 14.3 feet tall and opened around 28.2 feet wide. Needless to say, while not especially crowded that morning, the tunnel was far from empty. If it had been empty, de Grave might not have noticed so many drivers flashing their headlights at him. One car after the other was flashing its lights, as if tapping out a message in Morse code. A motorcycle weaved in and out of traffic farther back. It was Spadino, racing his motorcycle like a man possessed. Witnesses would theorize that he was trying to catch up with de Grave's truck to flag him down and warn him. There was smoke coming from under the cabin of his truck. De Grave came to a stop, inching over to the side of the road. Fires like these weren't entirely unheard of, and in some cases, they were small enough that they could be extinguished by the driver himself. So de Grave bent down to get a look at just what he was dealing with. And when he got down there, a ball of flame engulfed the truck, powered by more than 100 gallons of diesel, and boosted by the extremely flammable margarine that was in his truck. The margarine was basically just emulsified vegetable oil that, once melted, created combustible fumes. So even though he was just transporting foodstuffs, for all intents and purposes, de Grave's Volvo might as well have been a tanker truck. De Grave made a run for it as the truck was being swallowed by the inferno. By this point, traffic had begun to further gather in the tunnel as the fire occurred at roughly the halfway point between the French and Italian sides, meaning many drivers were already well on their way inside when they encountered the debilitating smoke and fumes. In addition to making visibility difficult and breathing near impossible, one of the obstacles impeding escape for the drivers was that there simply wasn't enough usable oxygen for the engines of their cars to produce combustion. The drivers who didn't roll up their windows with the hopes of riding out the catastrophe until rescue could arrive abandoned their cars and made a run for the tunnel bunkers, which were specialized fire-resistant shelters installed roughly every half mile in the tunnel. Yet there were two problems for anybody trying to make it to those bunkers. For one, in addition to the smoke making visibility a problem, the heat had caused the electrical system of the tunnel to fail, so there was no lighting to guide them to those shelters. People couldn't see, they couldn't breathe, and they couldn't drive out the Italian side because even if their cars worked, de Grave's truck had created a barrier that prevented escape in that direction. In the midst of the chaos, Pierlucio Spadino Tinassi sprung into action to help, coming across an unconscious man who was still alive somehow. It was French truck driver Maurice Lebras. With poison fumes crowding out the oxygen, Spadino acted quickly, finding one of the nearby shelters and dragging Maurice in there with him, and then radioing the control room for help. In under 5 minutes, firefighters from the nearby Chamonix Fire Department arrived in 2 separate trucks, But while the firefighters may have had breathable oxygen tanks to support them, they didn't have enough, and even if they had, their vehicles malfunctioned the closer they got to de Graaf's burning Volvo anyway. So not only were their trucks not close enough to fight the flames, the firefighters were too far into the tunnel to retreat, and so they too sought the shelter of the bunkers. Now, it was around this same time that Italian emergency services made their way into the tunnel, venturing in as far as their sight would allow. While the conditions made visibility virtually impossible for the French firefighters, the Italians were actually able to make it to within a few hundred meters of de Graaf's truck. They had eyes on the vehicle, and its burning skeleton, and the flaming fuel gathering in the road and creeping towards the abandoned cars. While not what we would think of as an explosion, these were very dramatic combustions, eruptions of flame, because the fuel tanks turned these abandoned cars into flaming cars, and then these flaming cars amplified the other flames and thickened the smoke and turned up the heat exponentially. If there was any kind of miracle here at all, it's that in the moments before this eruption of flame, the firefighters had been able to reach drivers who were closer to the Italian side. In total, 12 survivors were led out of the tunnels to safety. Among them was Patrick Devoiseux, the truck driver of the Renault Express van, the motorcyclist, and friend of Spadino. But for the motorists on the French side, conditions were quickly becoming incompatible with survival, and some of the Italian firefighters had become trapped in the tunnel as well. There were 15 firefighters trapped in the tunnels total, and so the Italians launched a desperate rescue attempt. By this point, it was accepted that anybody who hadn't made it to one of the refuges along the tunnel walls could not have survived, and even the people who did make it into the shelters probably didn't have long due to the heat. The ventilation system for the tunnel ran underground and led into ventilation ducts inside the fire shelters, so while it was kind of a long shot and a slow-going retrieval process, this would provide the best chance of reaching any survivors in the shelters without being overcome. Yet it was still dangerous just due to the temperatures, the poor visibility, and the slow oxygen starvation. So it was a considerable act of courage for them to even attempt this, without knowing if anyone had even survived at all, or if they were just recovering those who had already perished. While it took the better part of 5 hours, the Italians were able to rescue and evacuate all of the firefighters who'd been trapped in the tunnel. Each was taken to the hospital in critical condition, but it was a bittersweet outcome. Nearly all of the firefighters ultimately survived, except for one, who sadly passed away from a heart attack due to the extreme heat and smoke inhalation. The fire burned for 2 days before temperatures reduced enough for crews to be able to go in and assess the damage and record a death toll. At the fire's peak, temperatures were estimated to have exceeded 1,000 degrees Celsius, or 1,832 degrees Fahrenheit. Recovery efforts simply weren't possible in the immediate aftermath without endangering the lives of more firefighters and rescue personnel. But once temperatures cooled, the full horrors of the Mont Blanc Tunnel fire became truly apparent. As one French firefighter would tell reporters later, quote, "The sights in the tunnel are unimaginable. There are heavy trucks which have melted into the tunnel floor until they are no higher than a car. Many of the bodies have been incinerated. All that remains are a few blackened bones." End quote. It was estimated that 29 people died in their vehicles, and 9 others perished trying to flee on foot. Among the 9 were Pierluigi Spadino Tinazzi and Maurice Lebras, The death of the single firefighter brought the death count to 39. It was an unthinkable loss, particularly in a tunnel that had become such a vital part of daily life for people in the region. While it did indeed take 2 days before temperatures cooled sufficiently for recovery teams to enter, it would actually take about 5 days before any evaluation of structural damage could be rendered, much less attempted. The tunnel would remain closed for 3 years while the structure was rebuilt and improved upon, and authorities investigated just how this happened in the first place. And while it took the better part of 6 years investigating, gathering evidence, and lining up the proverbial ducks before anybody was brought to trial for the Mont Blanc Tunnel fire, that day in court would eventually come. On January 31st, 2005, a total of 16 defendants were placed on trial for manslaughter. They included truck driver Gilbert Degrave, who had survived the tunnel fire, as well as Gérard Roncoli, the tunnel's French head of security, Chamonix Mayor Michel Charlet, former president of the French tunnel operator Rémi Chardon, the French and Italian operation companies themselves, Italy's chief of security for their side of the tunnel, and VOLVO, the company that manufactured the FH-12. The prosecution pushed back against the narrative that had taken hold in the intervening years, that this disaster had been somehow unavoidable, because even the theories that assigned blame still offered a possible out for the accused. For instance, there was debate over how the fire even started. One theory held that a cigarette stub tossed out of another vehicle entered into the Volvo's engine induction system and set the air filter on fire, which then ignited the margarine in the rear of the truck, a series of circumstances that aligned to create a disaster that wouldn't otherwise have occurred and arguably couldn't have been prepared for, depending on whose side you want to take. Yet this was part of the issue that tied back to VOLVO. Even if you allow for the possibility that this was just a freak accident, theoretically, it shouldn't have even been able to happen. The prosecution levied accusations that VOLVO should have been aware of faults in the design of the truck itself that could allow for this to happen. Combustible debris finding its way into the engine bay. For their part, VOLVO conducted their own investigation and found no such flaw, going so far as to suggest the fire was the result of an accidental and sudden oil leakage of unknown cause. In some ways, VOLVO was probably the biggest target out of all the defendants in terms of international recognition, but the negative sentiment in the court of public opinion seemed to center on Gilbert Degrave, who was accused of failing to move his vehicle into an emergency lane before abandoning it, resulting in the truck allegedly creating a barrier that prevented drivers from being able to get through to the Italian side of the tunnel and to safety. Now, the defense would push back against these claims, arguing that Degrave did everything he was supposed to do in that situation. He was said to have tried stopping the fire with the extinguisher in his cab and only made a run for it once it was clear there was nothing more he could do. And one would imagine that by the time he got out of the truck to check on the smoke, and the truck then ignited in a ball of flame, well, if he wasn't already in one of the emergency pull-off areas, it wasn't like he could safely re-enter the truck to drive to one, Yet the argument was that he should have gotten out to check only once he had made it into one of those side lanes, in order to prevent traffic blockage. For his part, Degrave refused to become the, quote, 40th victim, telling a French magazine, quote, "I swear I did nothing wrong. I did everything possible to try to ensure there would be no victims. I expect this trial to arrive at the truth, and I expect everyone to accept their share of the blame. End quote. Regardless, even if you accept the theory that de Graaf's actions made all of this worse, he's hardly the only one against whom you could levy that accusation, as this seemed to be as much of an institutional failure as any sort of individual one. Now, the trial was held in Grenoble, France, since the majority of the victims perished on the French side of the tunnel. Yet the alleged problems that resulted in this tunnel fire were as multinational as the construction of the tunnel itself back in the 1960s. The Guardian would review the institutional failings that formed the basis of the prosecution's case in that trial of 2005. Quote, "The main focus of the prosecution's criticism is reserved for the tunnel's operators, who will have to explain why an emergency drill had last been held in the tunnel in 1973, why safety teams had only half the equipment they needed, why the closed-circuit TV system was not working, why it took 9 minutes for the warning lights in the tunnel to be switched on, and why the tunnel's faulty ventilation system fueled the inferno with more fresh air rather than evacuating smoke and fumes." End quote. The main thrust of the case against management and operators was that this was a failure stemming from a lack of coordination between the French and Italian companies jointly in charge of the tunnel. For example, the French were able to signal for help sooner because they had smoke alarms that had been triggered just prior to de Graaf's truck igniting. But it was reported that the Italian side had no such warning since one of the crucial smoke detectors had been out of order, and Italy and France had never coordinated their rescue operations to come to a consensus on what the procedure would be should a disaster of this magnitude ever strike. So when it did strike, they were less prepared than they ought to have been. Yet even if they had coordinated, it might not have made a difference, since a false alarm from the day before the fire had disabled the smoke alarms on the Italian side of the tunnel, although another report I found suggested that tunnel workers had manually disabled them due to the false positives. Either way, the tunnel workers were unaware of the fire in its earliest stages, and while security cameras during those early stages of the fire allowed both the French and Italian sides to see that a fire had started in the tunnel, the picture quality was inadequate for them to see where it was actually coming from. And to make matters worse, as mentioned in the Guardian report earlier, the ventilation system was faulty, yes, but from what I gathered, it was mainly faulty in the sense that it was insufficient to actually fight any sort of fire. This was a longitudinal ventilation system meant to dilute vehicle exhaust. It wasn't going to remove smoke from a fire, yet the French tried using it to do just that. And it didn't work. And not just because it wasn't really designed to do that, but also because even if it had been, operators on the Italian side decided to use their ventilation system to pump fresh air into the tunnel, on the premise that this would help fight the fire, only for that decision to instead feed the fire rather than slow it down, and push more smoke over to the French side. This bolstered the prosecution's argument that there was a lack of a unified command structure here. France was responsible for France, Italy was responsible for Italy, and never the twain shall meet. And because of this, it was alleged that the people in charge of rescue operations had not been adequately trained, that they didn't understand the systems they were in charge of using in the first place. A report by The Independent would recount another aspect of the prosecution's case, this one related to the firefighters and rescue personnel, noting that an Italian rescue crew that reached the fire didn't know how to operate their emergency truck and had to then be rescued themselves, while firefighters from the French end didn't have sufficient breathing equipment. As noted, a proper emergency drill had not been conducted since 1973, some 26 years before the Mont Blanc Tunnel fire. So how could they possibly learn and improve if learning and improving hadn't been a priority in close to 3 decades? A preliminary report on the tunnel fire alleged that the management company in charge of the tunnel had prioritized toll fees over security. So none of what the prosecution was arguing was new information. These were alleged to have been known institutional failures that simply never got addressed. If nothing else, the tunnel's very design made it dangerous. On the one hand, it was smart to install those shelters with fire-resistant blast doors, but they weren't built to withstand this kind of prolonged onslaught. In explaining how Pierlucio Tinazzi and Maurice Febra perished despite having made it to one of the fire refuges, a New York Times report from 2019 would state, quote, "The refuge had a fire door rated to a 4-hour standard. The fire burned for 50 hours." End quote. In essence, people did precisely what they were supposed to do, and they died anyway. Because the tunnel was openly hostile to survival. You had extremely combustible cargo being transported in a compact, poorly ventilated area that was too short and too narrow for the size of the trucks it was taking in. One traffic accident could turn a truck into a giant wall that prevented travel in either direction. And this is before addressing the other elephant in this crowded room. You see, it wasn't just that the tunnel was insufficient to accommodate heavy goods vehicles, but that because it was built in the mid-1960s, the tunnel was not sufficient to accommodate modern heavy goods vehicles with their larger cargo, their bigger fuel tanks, and greater volume of combustible elements. And this is how regional government officials ended up being prosecuted as well. Chamonix Mayor Michel Charlet was a controversial defendant because some argued he really didn't belong there, as the September 2005 edition of the Transportation and Environment Bulletin noted that not only did the position of mayor hold no real authority over tunnel operations, but Mayor Charlet, despite his lack of influence over their operation, had actually expressed his concerns about the tunnel anyway, calling for the amount of trucks admitted into the tunnel to be reduced. This was a trial that was essentially tailor-made for the Monday morning quarterback, but it wouldn't be the newspapers or the court of public opinion that would decide its outcome. If it had been, there might have been an entirely different outcome altogether. The trial was expected to last 3 months, yet it took 6 before a verdict was rendered. On July 27, 2005, 13 out of the 16 defendants were convicted of involuntary manslaughter or negligence. And while these are obviously convictions no person should ever want on the books against them, you would be hard-pressed to argue that the punishment fit the alleged crime. The harshest sentence fell upon Gérard Roncoli, the tunnel's head of security, who only received a 6-month prison term on top of a 2-year suspended sentence, meaning after he finished his 6 months, he would be released from prison but have to spend the next 2 years on best behavior or else get sent back to jail for 2 years. So not great, but not really a punishment commensurate with the gravity of being even fractionally responsible for 39 deaths. For his alleged role, truck driver Gilbert Degrave would receive a 4-month suspended sentence. Meanwhile, Rémi Chardon, who had been president of the company in charge of France's side of the tunnel, received a 2-year suspended sentence and a fine of roughly 15,000 euros, or about $18,000 US. Michel Charlet, the mayor of Chamonix, who some felt shouldn't have even been charged, was also convicted and given a 6-month suspended sentence and the same €15,000 fine that Chardon got. An appeal would be filed, and in 2007, Mayor Charlet's conviction would be overturned. As for the French and Italian firms in charge of the tunnels, they received fines to the tune of about €150,000 each, or around $180,000, which still doesn't sound like much when set against the backdrop of everything that happened. However, the New York Times would report that the company in charge of the Italian side of the tunnel would place €13.5 million into an escrow account for the families of the victims, on the condition that it was only to be paid out once 80% of the 238 relatives of the victims agreed to accept the settlement. And even then, the company was quick to emphasize that this payment was in no way an acknowledgement of liability. Because even when you're admitting some kind of culpability, you have to cover your ass so that people don't think you're actually admitting any culpability. 2 individual defendants were acquitted, but of the companies named in the lawsuit, only one was fully acquitted: VOLVO. It was found that there appeared to be no design flaws in the FH-12 itself. However, some accused Volvo of tacitly acknowledging some level of guilt when they made changes to the engine of the FH-12 following the tunnel fire. Yet Volvo's technical advisor to legal counsel would snap back in a statement, declaring, quote, "We make more than 700 changes to our engines each year in order constantly to enhance their performance and make other feature improvements, in particular with respect to fuel consumption and environmental issues. The changes were not made as a consequence of the Mont Blanc Tunnel accident and were implemented at different times, some even before the Mont Blanc accident." End quote. Irrespective of who was ultimately at fault, changes were necessary. Between the events of the fire and the trial, the tunnel was completely renovated to more modern safety standards. I'm talking stuff like newly pressurized, reinforced fire-resistant shelters with video communication equipment, clean air escape shafts, localized smoke extraction instead of longitudinal airflow, a central unified French-Italian command structure, cargo safety inspection stations prior to entry on both sides of the tunnel, stricter traffic and entry regulations to prevent convoys forming, fire crews stationed at or sometimes even inside the tunnel, and regular safety drills. The EU would eventually adopt Directive 2004/54/EC to establish minimum safety requirements for road tunnels in the Trans-European network, and this included administrative provisions to ensure a clear allocation of responsibilities amongst all the different parties involved, like administrative authorities, tunnel managers, safety officers, and inspection entities. This fire redefined standards of safety in the EU, at least for tunnels. All of this was a remarkable turnaround, and incredibly necessary if the Mont Blanc Tunnel was to ever reopen, and if anything was to be learned from the tragedy and the heroism of those who lost their lives in the attempt of saving others. In the years after the fire, Pierlucio Tinazzi, nicknamed Spadino, would become a folk hero of sorts, memorialized for rescuing between 10 and 12 people before perishing in the fire. And if you're wondering why I never mentioned him saving 12 people earlier, it's because, sadly, he didn't. A later report would reveal that Spadino's legend was the result of reporters having confused him with another motorcyclist who'd gone back into the fire to assist in the rescue of the 12 Italian survivors. Yet that motorcyclist hadn't actually been on a motorcycle at the time. He had been driving a Renault Express van. It was Spadino's old co-worker, Patrick Devoiseau. A newspaper article would reveal why Devoiseau never corrected the record once Spadino's legend took off. Quote, "He had remained silent, modestly, so as not to diminish the merits of his Italian biker friend, who died after saving 10 people. Today, the truth is known. Patrick Devoiseau, 44 years old, motorcycle patrol officer, driving his Renault Express, helped motorists escape and took in 3 truck drivers, saving between 10 and 15 people from certain death." End quote. Yet Spadino had still died attempting to save another life. He had still chosen, selflessly, while having a better path to escape than others considering he was on a motorcycle, to head back in to at least try to bring somebody out with him. Rather than riding out to safety, he would leave behind that BMW K75 motorcycle, a motorcycle that would be found virtually melted into the ground, to go try and save somebody else. So while Spadino's legend may have been exaggerated, his heroic qualities weren't, and as a result, he was buried with honors and awarded Italy's gold medal for civil valor, in addition to a posthumous medal from the Fédération Internationale de Motocyclisme, in further recognition of his role as a shining example of motorcyclists the world over. A group of bikers would gather at the mouth of the Mont Blanc Tunnel every year to ride in his honor, to complete the trip he never could and share in the experience of riding, which he'd loved so much while he was here. Disasters don't always have a single cause, and even when it could be argued that they do, they often have contributing factors that compound the damage they cause. So while it's easy to point fingers, I think culpability in situations like these is more complex. Yet the tragedy is that although the Mont Blanc Tunnel is arguably safer now than it was ever initially designed to be, over 36 people died to make that possible, when no one should have perished at all. And the failing here is institutional, because while you could say that people in the 1960s couldn't have known how far or how fast transportation would evolve, it doesn't excuse that safety protocols didn't evolve to meet it. In that sense, it feels like there really should have been a greater reckoning, a more substantial punishment, to meet the weight of what occurred, its preventability, and the comprehensively incomprehensible suffering of those whose lives were lost. In lieu of being able to rewrite the past, I think the best thing anyone can really do is take measures to prevent that past from becoming Prologue. Thank you for watching. If RCR Stories add any value to your week, please leave a like, a comment, share the video, or even subscribe, and tap the bell icon so you're notified for every new video. But if you want to support these videos in the biggest possible way, join us on Patreon for just $1, where you'll get these videos early and ad-free, along with other exclusive content. Thank you so much for watching, and have an outstanding rest of your week.